We're going to talk about plastics as a lever to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I don't know, I'm sure many of you noticed recently The Economist ran a series of articles in praise of plastics, which of course is a bit surprising, making the case that because although plastics are very much maligned, they actually do have a critical role to play in a lower carbon future. Surprise, surprise, if we use them wisely. And that's of course the clause that is the crux, because what that series of articles really seemed to underline, if you read it carefully, was that there is this incredible disconnect. It completely underscored the lack of understanding on the part of consumers and consumer groups about how industries like the plastic industries or how other hard-to-abate industries actually have to go about decarbonizing. And that is, of course, by using incremental steps. So today we're going to look at how LyondellBasell is advancing that reality, of course, with solutions like Circulen Renew and Revive that we have talked about already, the Circulen portfolio, helping brands to cut their fossil sources today while investing in these decarbonization pathways that will tackle Scope 3 emissions. But it's also about decarbonizing assets. And that's what we'd like to talk about now, because obviously not everything can be done through circularity, especially right now. And we need to be moving forward all the time in small increments. So let's welcome our speakers to talk about this. Please put your hands together for Andrea Brown. She is the Vice President and CSO at LyondellBasell. So here she is coming from the back of the room. Give her a warm round of applause. And joining us on this panel, it's a very small panel, very intimate panel, is Duncan Flack, who's the Global Sustainability Lead at Honeywell and Chairman of the CiPPPA. Duncan, where are you? You had to get out from behind some chairs. The CiPPPA, just because we're into acronyms here, Circularity in Primary Pharmaceutical Packaging Accelerator. So we're looking forward to their insights. Have a seat, both of you, and a warm welcome. And you know, we've talked quite a bit about how to start off this panel. And with the fact, obviously, we've got a very, very straightforward question when we say, is there a business case for sustainability here? But the answers are far, far more complex than that. So, Andrea, perhaps I can just start with you to talk about this business case and the difference in sort of the different streams of where decarbonization is happening with
Sure.
LYB.
Yep. Thanks, Karen. So I think, business-led sustainability. So what does that mean when we think beyond circularity? And one of the things that we know and we recognize is a lot of companies have existing Scope 3 goals. Our circular solutions help support those. We heard from Yvonne, we heard over the last couple of days, the pretty significant product carbon footprint benefit that can be achieved through those solutions. But what we're also interested in better understanding is how can we support unlocking value for customers as they continue in their Scope 3 journey through the decarbonization solutions that will come as we decarbonize our assets. So essentially, we do Scope 1 and 2 projects. Those will reduce our CO2 emissions and thereby reduce the CO2 footprint of the products that we can sell our customers. And that can, in addition to the circular solutions, help them on their Scope 3 journey. The big challenge, of course, is that those investments cost pretty significant capital. We're talking in the hundreds of millions of dollars. If you think about things like a hydrogen project or a CCS or a CCU project, they take a lot of time. They can take 5 to 10 years to think about that project from the start into, when we will actually have products on the market. And so if you think about companies that have Scope 3 goals for 2030, and they think about how their raw materials will be decarbonized over time, what we're very interested in understanding is how can we help unlock the value of those customers meeting those goals with the solutions that we can provide from these decarbonization projects. How will that business case work? How will that value be created? Where will it be created? I think one of the things that we've heard over the last couple of days is customers will not pay for a decarbonized product alone. And so one of the things that we're starting to hear and learn is that, that value may be generated in different ways. It could come from a deeper relationship with a brand and the retailer. It could come from the interest a very forward-leaning brand has on essentially shaping a market and being at the very front end of that. It could come from regulation. It certainly will have to come from regulation at some point, but we're trying to understand where that early move will come from. So it's a whole range of things, and I would say what we're trying to better understand through many conversations with many of you and others is how can we help partner and collaborate in that value journey as we think about Scope 3, in addition to the circular solutions that we have today.
Thanks very much for that overview. And Duncan, I'll just come to you to possibly respond to that as well, but maybe detail the two roles that you've brought to the table here as well.
Yeah, so my paid life is with Honeywell, looking after healthcare and life sciences. I'm the global sustainability lead for those, and I tend to look after circularity, packaging, end of life, Scope 3 downstream. And then over and above that, in my so-say spare time, I run this not-for-profit, which we set up, called CiPPPA, and it's convening the entire, or at least as much as my megalomania will allow me, as much of the pharmaceutical industry, global OTC brands, to work together and to launch nationwide take-back schemes to collect all the waste packaging associated with 3 packaging formats. That's metered dose inhalers, not auto-injectors, but injector pens, and blister packs. And the reason that we're trying to convene as broad a cross-section of the industry as possible is because the only way we're actually going to be able to influence that societal and behavioural change that's required to bring sort of transformational change across an industry, I believe, is by having this wholesale approach and collective ambition across an industry. And my apologies to my fellow diners last night. This is the moment you can tune out. I have a...
Are you going to be chewing your cabbage again?
Well, no. There's a case study which I love to quote because I think it was just brilliant in its conception and its implementation and delivery. And it's with Colgate-Palmolive, which most of you will know, manufacture toothpaste tubes. And the vast majority of toothpaste tubes in the world used to contain a layer of aluminium within them, which rendered them non-recyclable. And Colgate-Palmolive, who have a fairly substantial market share, circa 60%, I think they're present in something astonishing, like about 5 billion households globally. They, along with their competitors, Haleon, P&G, Unilever, were trying desperately to come up with a recyclable solution and a decarbonised solution. So they worked with their partners, with waste manufacturers and the like, to establish a material, a mono-material, that would be recyclable. And eventually, after a number of years working on this, they came up with their solution and they brought it to market with a wonderful and appropriate fanfare of, ta-da, look at our wonderful toothpaste tube. It's now recyclable. You can go and recycle it. Oh, and by the way, Procter & Gamble, Unilever, Haleon, all of their competitors, over whom they now had an established and very attractive competitive advantage. Here's the IP. This is what the product's made of. This is who makes it. Here's our entire value chain. Please take it, use it. It's our gift to you, to the industry. And it was really bold. It was the CEO that took the decision. It was a really bold decision, really powerful, because but the most important and crucial thing to this, I think, was that they recognized the only way that they were going to ensure that their toothpaste tube was recycled is if every single toothpaste tube became recyclable. So they influenced that entire societal behavioral change, which resulted in now, in excess of 95% of toothpaste tubes in America are made of this same material. So they brought this change about by exploiting a dominant position, perhaps, but working collaboratively across the industry, and inevitably within every sustainable conversation you hear people time and time again referencing the importance of collaboration. And I think there quite often exists quite a large gulf, and it's been amazing here these last 2 days, and I'm hugely impressed by your team and everybody associated with this event. It's been really very, very brilliant and very well put together. And it shows the interest in collaboration, I think, that you have as a company, which is so important, because the gulf that exists between people that talk about collaboration and those that actively are involved in collaboration still is quite substantial. And that's what needs to close, I believe. Yeah.
Thanks very much for that. A wonderful example. Now, Andrea, you mentioned regulation and how that is obviously going to help shape this journey. How are the plastics industry and the CPGs, or consumer packaging goods, as we call them, working to actually influence the guidelines that exist already on greenhouse gas reduction accounting, which is really what you're looking at when you're comparing these vastly different pictures of reduction?
So I would say that this sort of ecosystem of measurement frameworks is extremely complex. There's a lot of letters in all these things. It's very confusing. Thankfully, not so confusing to those that sort of work in this space. But I would say, one of the key things that we're very actively doing, and I would say we certainly invite partners on this journey with us, is you start with the product carbon footprint. We've heard a lot about that over the last couple of days, just in terms of how do we make sure we actually have confidence in that data, in what we're leveraging to support the consumer claims that the brands are really at the front end of. We have an extremely robust team working on that. Diana in my team is here. She leads that organization. She and her team have all the technical expertise to support that in our company. But maybe leaning on what Duncan talked about in terms of collaboration, it's absolutely, you can't do that as one company. You have to absolutely have an approach that is aligned with science. It's aligned with international standards, and increasingly, how do sectors importantly play a role in aligning together so that as we sell to a brand, that brand can understand what product has a lower product carbon footprint at the end of the day. So we've been very active in a group called Together for Sustainability. It's over 50 chemical companies aligning on product carbon footprint approaches, along with, by the way, many other aspects around procurement. But certainly that's been one of the key outputs over the last couple of years that has really driven a consistent, aligned approach across the industry on product carbon footprint. Then that supports things like how is that information shared along the value chain? We've been very active in a group called PACT, Partnership for Action on Climate Transparency. So that's an organization convened by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, where Nancy used to work. By the way, I used to also work there, but it's over 250 companies across all value chains coming together on a whole range of sustainability solutions. And this is, of course, one of the critical ones that will help unlock Scope 3 action. And so that is really working across the value chain to have consistency in how that information is shared across industries. That then feeds into the corporate accounting. So what we call greenhouse gas protocol, how do companies measure climate-related emissions, GHG emissions, and those standards need to fit together. They currently do not fit together very well, and so it's it's a moment in time, 2025, where those standards are being updated, and there is very concerted action across many companies across the value chain on how to make these things fit together better so that the incentive structure actually supports not only us, but of course customers in how do they get the GHG impact in their CO2 footprint that they disclose, of course, publicly to their stakeholders. And then, of course, layered on top of that is SBTI, so the target setting guidance. How do we then align things like mass balance, very important concepts that support that GHG reduction to flow. That's also being updated this year, mass balance. If anybody's familiar with the guidance that has just been released for consultation, for Scope 3 mass balance is now included in the consultation draft, which is extremely important for all of what we're talking about here today in how do you get that acceptability of things like mass balance to really scale. And then, of course, we need things like chain of custody more broadly, ISCC Plus and other certification schemes to not only support the chain of custody approaches for biocircular feedstocks or chemical recycling feedstocks, but also as we think about low carbon projects at assets, we need that mass balance system to allow that value to flow to where the market will pay for it. So all of that needs to fit together. that's a very concerted activity happening now. We cannot do that as one company or even one industry. We need partners in this, and there are platforms where we convene. So I would encourage anybody who maybe yourselves or your teams are interested in understanding how you may be able to play an important role in that to speak to any of us, because we can help let you know on how to get involved.
And on that note, let's put the QR code back up there, and a reminder to the audience that you can start throwing your questions into our tool. Duncan, perhaps I can just get you to pick up on that, and from the brand owner perspective, and what you're hearing. How are they progressing through their net zero roadmap, given these alignment issues that, and how is that going to be sort of resolved going forward?
Well, it's probably easier if I sort of default to my area of expertise, which is blister packs, pharma packaging, and address first off the sort of the challenges that the industry faces, which are fairly sort of broad based. So first off, from a collection perspective, blisters can't be put into standard household waste streams because they have medicinal contamination. If they do manage to get collected, by the time they get to the MRFs, the PERFs, the material plastics recycling facilities, they drop through the holes in the trommels, like these big drums, like a washing machine, and there are holes within them. And because it represents a small fraction waste, they drop through the holes. Typically, the materials used are multi-laminate structures, which represent challenges from a recycling perspective, be it mechanical, chemical, call it what you will. So that it's small fraction waste. From a regulatory perspective, we have to use virgin material. We're not allowed to use recycled content in any shape or form. And the materials themselves are typically sort of multi-laminate, but also are inherently single-use by design. So trying to address all of those and enabling the industry as a whole to decarbonize is fundamentally challenging. And typically it's very, very difficult to resolve one of those problems in isolation. You need to address them sort of almost collectively at the same time. And that's part of the reason for sort of coming back to this concept of collaboration. So there are a number of firms I know that have been working within the industry looking at and reassessing their materiality. Because in blisters alone, I can list 8, 9, probably 10 different plastics that are used in the manufacturing of these products. So that critically sort of impacts the economics of any potential recycling stream. So in the UK, there are something around between, it's quite a big delta, but it's very difficult to get an exact figure because of the industry's impacts on or the sectors. There's between 2.5 billion blisters every year that are distributed into the UK. Of those, the largest single segment of that sort of pie chart, if you will, was probably made up of PVC blisters with an aluminium lidding foil. Now, as companies, manufacturers of materials, are trying to promote their sustainable solutions, this is my view, not Honeywell's or CiPPPA's, I should qualify. My view is that they're potentially trying to gainsay the market and overly commercialize a sustainable solution. So company A is saying you need to use a monopolyprop blister. Company B is saying you need to use a mono HDPE blister. Company C is saying you need to use a mono PET blister. They still can't be recycled because they still suffer from the same fundamental challenges that I've listed. So it is a step towards achieving decarbonisation, but it is not the solution. And what we're trying to do, as I say, is a sort of approach and embrace all of those by assessing the materiality aspects of it. PVC, which has typically been the base material that's been used, represent fundamental challenges in both mechanical and chemical recycling for a variety of reasons, which I suspect most people in the room will be aware of. So trying to understand, and I think that probably this addresses some of the challenges that you have, Andrea, as an organisation, it's trying to understand where the demand is coming from within the markets. I was always taught in my sort of early days of business studies that it was the classic sort of British concept of developing a product which you thought was brilliant and everyone was going to love to buy, and then you just find a way to shoehorn it into the market. Whereas we all learn when we actually get involved in business that the knack and the skill to this is finding out what the customer actually wants. And then delivering the product that fits to those needs. And I think understanding the demands and the drivers, and going back to topics that have already been discussed, the eco-design principles involved. And there's been a number of sort of systemic reviews now and papers that have been authored, which have assisted in looking at eco-design principles for blisters, and I could very easily, this adds to sort of the complexity that you face, I could very easily say, for all low to no barrier products, chuck them all into polyprop, because it provides a degree of barrier protection. Anything requiring a high to an ultra-high barrier, chuck it all into cold form foil. The disadvantage in doing that is, A, it does me out of a job, because that's my business sort of wiped out, which is rather unfortunate. And B, for large operators in the industry, if they're running as a large global OTC brand we work closely with, they've got 25, 30 blister pack machines running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And if I suddenly told them they've got to switch to cold form foil, and that they're going to need 60 machines running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it's going to take them twice as long to pack everything, they're not going to be extremely pleased with these recommendations. So quite often the solutions can appear simple, but in delivery they're actually rather complicated and complex. So that doesn't answer your challenges at all. But I think it probably talks to some of the complexities that we face, and I'm trying to unpick that is a notoriously difficult task. But going back to the sort of the original topic that we were sort of presenting this under, enabling those incremental changes and enabling companies to taking incremental changes towards decarbonisation is vital, because everybody wants to tell a story about how they're improving their sustainability, how they're improving their carbon footprint, how they're decarbonising their business in one shape, form or another. So working with your customers, with your clients, and to enable them to achieve that is ultimately what I think we're all working towards, because as we all full well know, there really aren't any silver bullets out there.
Absolutely. What is LyondellBasell actually doing concretely to support those PCF reduction goals at brand owner and converter level, and what is sort of needed at industry level?
So I'd say we're doing quite a lot. So firstly, we have PCFs for a lot of our portfolio at the moment, and we're certainly supporting the product carbon reduction of those products from, for example, our Circulen portfolio. We also have a portfolio called Plus LC, which is more on the chemical side of our business, where we are able to offer a lower product carbon footprint from that side of our business, particularly through biocircular feedstocks. And that offers a very significant advantage from a product carbon footprint perspective. So we're doing a lot in terms of supporting, existing demands around not only the information side of things, because we do see certainly an increase in requests for, understanding baseline product carbon footprint data from what customers are buying today, to everything from how do we then support the more sustainable portfolio and support the kind of claims and goals that customers have, whether those are circularity oriented or also decarbonization oriented. And of course, many of those solutions tick both of those boxes, right? So, so I would say that is, one of the key pieces of activity that we have ongoing. Certainly, as we think about the standardization of things like product carbon footprint alignment, this is again where Together for Sustainability plays an important role for us as an industry to support that aligned approach across the industry in terms of how do we measure the product carbon footprint in a more consistent way that offers more consistency, comparability, confidence to the market in terms of that information. And of course, there's a lot of other activity happening in industry associations as well. I would say that Together for Sustainability was maybe more at the front end of pulling the industry together around some of these common challenges across the supply chain. And that includes product carbon footprint in terms of how do we deliver that information in a consistent fashion to the market.
Okay, thanks. You mentioned, Duncan, the sort of the influences of societal behavior with the brilliant example of the toothpaste tubes. Blister packs, obviously, something that are impossible to recycle at the moment. How can brand owners actually help influence that kind of behavior to sort of embrace the solutions that are out there and bring these various technologies forward? There's
a number of sort of ways that we're looking to sort of to work collectively, and one of the reasons that CiPPPA first came about was because within the industry there were a number of sort of smaller solutions that were starting to come to light. So we're UK-centric at the moment, so apologies for the sort of focus on that. But Boots, a nationwide store of chemists, were running a take-back scheme, Superdrug, something similarly with TerraCycle. So whilst they're not impossible to recycle, they're jolly difficult to recycle. CPI, the Centre for Product Innovation, had authored a systemic paper recommending a systemic review of the industry and the design of the material of the products. The Sustainable Medicines Partnership were doing some work on blisters. Global Self-Care Federation were doing some work on blisters, blah, blah, blah. But unfortunately, they're all working in isolation. And there was, again, this sort of lack of collaboration. And the service providers, whether it was the material manufacturers and suppliers or whether it was the end sort of providers, the waste management firms, weren't being discussed and weren't being consulted. And quite often you find in these sort of scenarios that people come up with a wonderful idea of how they're going to resolve circularity, and then they go and talk to the waste management firm and they say, no, why, we can't do that. Why are you even suggesting it? So it's important that you do consult this entire value chain first and foremost. But what we're looking to ensure by coordinating these efforts and ensuring that everybody understands what everybody else is doing, it takes away the concept of the same sort of service providers being asked multiple questions by multiple sources. You get asked a single question by a single point of contact that disseminates the information across the industry, so it makes it a lot easier for them to coordinate their activities. It helps valorize the waste streams, but more importantly, when it comes to the messaging, it becomes coordinated. So instead of having individual conversations that are on a similar topic but at a slightly different time and voiced in a slightly different way, worded in a slightly different way, you've got a single voice which is being replicated across an entire industry, being promoted at the same time, in the same way, using the same terminology, and that voice then becomes so much louder, it becomes a sort of literally a clarion call across the entire industry. And that engenders elements of this societal behavioural change. Similarly, there are concepts like nudge theory, and for people who sort of are or aren't aware of nudge theory, it's about sort of changing the environment in which decisions are made, as opposed to ramming or forcing a decision upon somebody or upon a consumer. You have a sort of presumed solution in place. So in the UK, again, for example, there was a lack of investment in pensions within the workforce. So people are now pre-opted into a pension, and they have to then opt out of it. Similarly, looking in the waste management world, the recycling bins or the waste bins that you have in a house, the one for your general waste, it's generally smaller than the one that you have for your recycling waste. So psychologically, that infers and recommends to the household that they should be placing less into their general waste and more into their recycling waste, which helps engender an improvement and an increase in the amount of material that's being recycled. So utilising aspects of nudge theory can be very effective in bringing about this sort of societal behavioural change again. But it does still require this collective ambition across an industry. We have an example within the pharma packaging world on metered dose inhalers. GSK ran a take-back scheme for about 9 or 10 years, and they've got a large chunk of the market. But during that time that they ran it, they only got about 2 or 3% of the volume of materials back, which is woefully inadequate, I think any of us would recognise. And I say that in no way being critical of what GSK did, because they ran a very, very well-structured scheme. But I think they were slightly ahead of their time. The propensity to recycle is a lot stronger now than it was when they were running the scheme. But also, they did it on their own. And they didn't have the backing, as evidenced by the Colgate scenario, of an entire industry sort of pulling in the same direction. So it's these subtle changes that I think can help deliver that sort of those individual points of leverage and bring the change that we require.
Okay, I'm going to go to questions here now because we have some coming in. We have a few minutes left. Wondering, could pharma use chemically recycled resins?
Great question. I hope so. The wording within MHRA, EU Pharmacopoeia, FDA doesn't specify that you can't use PCR. What it does say is you can't use waste in primary pharmaceutical packaging, that which comes into contact with a drug. Now that, to my mind, has always begged the question on the definition of waste. And when is waste no longer considered waste? And the answer to that question, in my view, my opinion, is when that waste becomes a feedstock. So if, through a recycling process, you can generate feedstocks, pyrolysis oils, then why can't you use that?
Indeed.
That's my challenge.
Answers yet another question, or at least puts the question out to the question. Yeah. Andrea, how is LYB managing certification of, for example, chain of custody of PCF footprint for low carbon feedstock in relation to process emissions? So, for example, steam and energy, through attributing reduction to specific products.
So that is an activity that is underway right now, and I would say very active involvement by many of us in LYB, but many other companies as well. I think, Duncan talked about sort of collective ambition, and I think, we have a lot of collective ambition around things like circularity. We have a lot of collective ambition around things like CO2, GHG emissions. We have SBTI targets. We have many other things. So I think that exists. I think what's happening now is that everybody is understanding that the business case is actually really, really tricky when it comes to the big investments beyond the sort of energy efficiency gains and process efficiency gains that we've all been making for, a decade or so. So I think one of the things that we've recognized, almost woken up to, not only us but many others in our industry, is that as we think about these more expensive investments, we're going to need mass balance to support the flexibility in being able to make those investments at certain assets where that business case is strongest. And then we can allow those essentially chain of custody, mass balance, low carbon benefits to flow in a credible way towards customers and that willingness to pay. And so that leveraging your existing assets, using mass balance, and allowing, the approach to be flexible, credible, accountable, claimable is absolutely critical to actually making all of this work in a way that supports the goals that companies have around Scope 3, SBTI, but also the product-related claims that they may want to make right down to the consumer. And so that system is being developed. I would say we are in the stages now of understanding what level of flexibility and acceptability makes sense for us and for the customers that we anticipate requiring those certificates in the future. But certainly there is a wider approach that is starting to happen, whether that's in our sector associations or things like ISCC or others, on a collective approach related to product carbon footprint mass balance.
And specifically to the concern, obviously, that a lot of these targets, we're talking about 2030, which is literally just around the corner.
It is.
There's a question here, given that CapEx decarbonization projects might take up to over a decade or more, how can LyondellBasell actually then help brand owners reduce these Scope 3 emissions within this next 5-year period?
Yeah. So I would say we have existing low carbon solutions. We've talked a lot about our circulant portfolio over the last couple of days. Jaap presented yesterday. We talked a little bit about renewable electricity. We can take those certificates from a renewable electricity down towards the product level, and we could support CO2 reductions through that. We have Plus LC. We do have opportunities today to support GHG reduction goals of our customers. What we're looking at is sort of beyond 2030 as we think about the next set of goals. Many of us have net zero goals. We're all trying to figure out, how do we actually get there? How do we actually support that 1.5 degree scenario? How much will it cost? Is there a willingness to pay? Where does the regulation need to come in? And so I think it's really an invitation also to customers, here in this room, and certainly others that may not be here today, we welcome that conversation, because indeed it's going to require a collaborative effort to understand, how do we actually unlock that? What's the right time to unlock that? We cannot be making, big investment decisions that don't support, the market development to happen at the same time. So it's absolutely critical that we work together on that.
Okay, thanks very much. Very much supporting Duncan's collaboration comments. There's one more question here for you, Duncan, and then I'll ask Martino to be relatively sort of tight on his presentation because we're already going into a minute over. But there's a question here: what does CiPPPA do to realize these take-back schemes systems that you mentioned, and what is the desired global reach of a system like that?
So we are consciously launching in the UK. I consciously don't use the words trial or pilot because there's been a lot of those. And we're basing the whole premise on simplicity because I think too often there's so much in sustainability that gets complicated. The basis being wherever people go to pick up their prescription devices, metered-dose inhalers, injectors, blisters, they can drop off their empties at the same time. So whether that is a care home, a chemist, a hospital, a doctor's surgery, a pharmacist, a prison, wherever it might be, they drop the empties off as picking up the new prescription, and then using the healthcare distribution agencies, the alliances, the AAHs, the Phoenixes, and so on, they collect the waste products, bring them back to a centralized location, and then they're sent off. And there are clearly sort of nuanced differences. Whilst that front end is replicable across all three waste streams, there is nuanced difference between the recycling requirements for the respective devices, not least because one's a gas, one's a solid, and one's a liquid. Or the medicines are present in those forms. And then with regards, I'll try and get this quick, the sort of the global reach or the reach beyond the UK, once we've got the principle established in the UK, it is anticipated and hoped what we're looking to be able to do, because all of our members have a global footprint, to roll the same scheme out throughout Europe, throughout the US, elsewhere. And I appreciate there are nuanced differences again. So in France, Citeo and Adelphi already collect blisters and then incinerate them. And I think in Germany, pharmaceutical waste has to be, due to regulations, has to be incinerated. So it's a matter of sort of adapting the solutions pertinent to the respective constraints within the respective countries. But that is, where we would like to get to. But it's jolly expensive.
Jolly expensive and jolly complicated all across the board. But thank you very much to both of you, Andrea Brown and Duncan Flack, for these insights into sort of the different level and incremental steps of decarbonization and reduction of GHG emissions by plastic, this marvelous material that we still need, on every level. Thank you so much to both of you, and I'm going to move on to Martino, so I'll let you take your places.